Joining me is Michael Franzese. He was a former capo in the Colombo family in New York. You know him. He's been on Fear City, the wonderful Netflix documentary in 2020 about the rise and fall of Cosa Nostra in New York. He co-authored the 1992 autobiography, Quitting the Mob. He is the owner of Franzese Wines, which specializes in Armenian wines, and that doesn't even begin to summarize you. How are you, sir?
I'm very good, sir. Thank you.
Look, you were really top of mind, especially considering, if you haven't, go back and watch Fear City on Netflix. It's a really 3-part great doc on, where things were by the late 70s and early 80s and how the authorities came together to kind of crack this racket. It gets into the concrete racket. Michael talks about gasoline and various other things, but you were top of mind this week because we are on the 40th anniversary, as you know, of the very high profile, audacious assassination of Paul Castellano, the head of the Gambino crime family, which obviously was Gotti and his crew came and did that. Where were you? I was under the impression that you were being arrested at that time. Things were kind of wrapping up and closing around you as well.
Yeah, I had gotten arrested 3 days later. I was arrested on the 19th, and then was in prison with a lot of guys, and there was a lot of talk about, obviously what went down with Castellano. It was a big deal. But, we knew there were tensions that were pretty high between the Gotti crew and Castellano. That word was on the street, so to speak. But then it happened, and obviously it's a big deal when a boss gets killed like that. And, a lot of conversation happened after that.
So it has to be sanctioned. I mean, what were they thinking? What were they romancing is my question. Like, shoot first, ask questions later, because you got to get some sort of even tacit approval for the other people. And I understand, and even in Fear City, some of his deputies and Confederates and people around him said it was us or them. If we didn't act, he was going to kill us for dealing drugs, Castellano.
Well, I think Gotti believed that. It wasn't only that. It was the recording that Angelo Ruggiero had.
Quack, quack.
Yeah, quack, quack. He said some things that were pretty bad, about Paul on those tapes. And I know because I heard some of them afterwards. Angelo and I had the same attorney, and I was in the attorney's office, and he let me listen to some of the tapes. They're pretty bad, so they would have got him in trouble. And so it was that, and also the alleged drug use by Gotti's crew. It came down to a point where he thought, at least, that it was either him or Paul. So what you do in a situation like that, you try to get as much support for what you're going to do as possible. So he did what he had to do. He didn't get all the support. I know Chin Gigante was very upset. My boss, Carmine Persico, didn't like what he did, so he didn't get it all. But he got enough to go through with it, and so he did.
Michael, between, in mafia circles, what's de jure and de facto, implied versus serious, someone like Paul Castellano, who was known as the businessman, Don, he was making all of this money and looked the other way when dope money would come in or porn money or the various other rackets. But I guess was the bigger lesson, if you're going to do it, don't get caught.
Well, yeah, and I get a lot of controversy. I get a lot of blowback on this whenever I say during my era in that life, and that was obviously Paul's era, we were not allowed to deal with drugs. We were told straight out, you deal with drugs, you die. That was kind of the overall rule in New York. Now, were some guys doing it? Yes. These are street guys. They're grinding out a living. If you did it, and you were passing the boss some money, would he overlook it? Probably. I wasn't in that situation, so I don't know. But yes, some guys were doing it. But what I try to make people understand, we were not major drug dealers. We were not anywhere near the cartels. We were not major drug dealers. That ended really back in the 60s with Genovese and a couple of those guys. We weren't allowed to do it. So if Gotti's crew was doing it, that could have put him in trouble.
All right, so take me back personally. I mean, the legend is you were going to go to college. Your father was an underboss in the Colombo family, and you had it buttoned down. I think by the late 60s, you were going to attend university and even be a pre-med. What happened? What diverged from that? Separate fact from fiction for us.
Well, I did attend 2 years at Hofstra University as a pre-med student. And then my dad gets sentenced to a 50-year prison sentence, and he goes away in 1970. And around the same time, Joe Colombo, who I was very close with the family, he started the Italian American Civil Rights League. I was very active in that as a way to help my father get out of prison. And eventually started to realize that my dad needed help. We had to get to the witnesses. I believe my dad was framed. I believe it until today. He was not guilty of bank robbery. So we had to do what we had to do to prove his innocence. And when I went to visit my dad in Leavenworth one point in time, I said, Dad, I'm not going to school. You're going to die in jail if I don't help you out. It was during that visit that he said to me, if you're going to be on the street, because he knew my mind was made up, I was influenced by Colombo, the whole bang. He said, then I want you to do it the right way. And to make a long story short, he decided to propose me into the family at that point in time. So I was about 20, 21 years old at that time.
Shouldn't Joe Colombo and the others have taken care of you if it was his implicit wish for you to go to college and be on the straight and narrow? Is there a sort of insurance system? Is there something that, look, if his father's looking at his life in prison, we got to provide for the family and somebody has to mentor you?
Well, nobody's going to provide for the family. That's a myth. People think that, when you go into that life, everybody's taking care of you and your family. It's not true. My dad had a few things going on the street, and after about 2.5 years, that was over. Whatever he had on the street was gone, and so there was no money coming into the house. I mean, I became a provider and supporter at the same time because I was the oldest of my brothers and sisters. So, we had to fend for ourselves. And my dad needed legal fees, lawyers' fees. We had to hunt down witnesses. We had to hire investigators. So there was a lot to it. And, it really all fell on me. And I was very willing to help my dad because I love my dad and I didn't want him to die in prison.
So what transpired between your kind of the entrance and intaking into I don't even know what you call it internally, this thing of ours. I'm thinking of Tony and Uncle Junior and the Sopranos. You don't actually call it, Dad, I want to go into a life of organized crime. I want to join the mafia. Cosanos. It's not like that, but I guess something happened between that epiphany and understanding in 1970, and then by the time you were made in 75. How did you get your sea legs in that?
Well, you understand, you said it truthfully. I did not aspire to be a mob guy. That wasn't my life. I was going to be a doctor. I was an athlete in school. But when my dad thought it was best for me to get involved in that life to help him, I said, fine, if that's what you want, I'm ready to go. So, I was in by the time I was, my dad, introduced me into that life. It took about 2.5 to 3 years for me to prove myself. And I know the questions that are coming, well, how did you prove yourself? What did you have to do? I know I'm always asked that. But I had to prove myself worthy to become a member, and I was told straight out, your father might have proposed you, but this is on you. It's not on him. So there was kind of a 3-year pledge period, 2.5 to 3 year pledge period where I had to do whatever I was told to do to prove myself worthy.
Not unlike the first year hire out of college or business school at H&R Block or E.F. Hutton, you have to kick up to an associate VP thing. I mean, it is kind of like a Fortune 500 setup. Will you explain for the uninitiated how it works at a kind of a soldier level, as an associate level, when you're being brought into the family, even before being a made man? You're looked at your money-making prowess or your enforcement prowess. I mean, who is the one who's judging you for, like, this kid, this is what he's going to be good at? And do you have to be taken under some other capo's wings?
Yeah, I mean, my captain at the time, Capo Regime, was Andrew Russo. He was Carmine Persico's first cousin. And Junior, who was the boss of the family, he was away in prisons. A fellow by the name of Tom DeBella, who was an old-timer, he was acting boss. And Andrew Russo was like underboss at that time, and he was also my captain. So he was kind of my mentor during that time. Him and Tom, I was very close to the boss. And you kind of find your own way. I was fortunate in that I knew how to use that life to benefit me in business, and I had kind of a business head, so I kind of went in that direction. I wasn't a street kid. I wasn't a thug in that regard. I mean, I was my father's son, so I had some stuff in me, but it was more. You have two divisions in that life, I would say. You have the racketeers and you have the gangsters. The racketeers are the guys that bring money into the family. In our family at that time, the Colombos, we had about 115 made guys that actually took the oath. We had a lot of associates, but actual made guys, 115. Out of that 115, maybe 20 of us were really earners. We were the racketeers. The other guys, well, who's making a living, who's trying to grind out something, they did a lot of the, grunt work, I would say, if you want to call it that. I don't know if that's the right expression, but they did a lot of that work. And, a gangster really doesn't have the ability to be a racketeer because he just doesn't know how to use the life in that regard. But a racketeer has to be both because you're going to be called upon to do some things no matter what division you're in. So I moved towards a racketeer. I used that life to benefit me in business, and I did what I had to do, and I rose in the ranks as a result of that. And, in 1980, they made me a captain.
So what were the revenue opportunities going back to the early 70s? I mean, it's a loan sharking, I imagine. Was it skimming? Was it still hijacking trucks back then? We see stuff in the Hollywood depiction of things. And then nowadays, which we'll take you to, much more mundane. But back then, I mean, there were so many things. And I have to ask you, almost in a Fortune 500 sense, were you on this kind of probationary thing? Like, let's see what this kid can do as a racketeer so that when the books open up again, we can recommend him to be made.
Absolutely. They're watching you. Are you disciplined? Can you accept authority? Are you a money earner? Are you a thug? What category do you fit in? And obviously, early on, I established myself as being a guy who knew how to earn. So, and that was kind of the path that I was on. And they were happy to put me on that path because if I earn, they earn, it goes up the ladder. So, that's the way it was. And like I said, I quickly realized how to use that life. Now, were we all into shylocking? Yes. Major business of the mob. Gambling? Yes. We had bookmakers that answered to us. We were the bookmakers ourselves, or we had bookmakers that worked under us. I was in both. I was putting money out on the street at some point. I also had a number of bookmakers that answered to me. Labor racketeering, huge. I used the unions, to help me earn a living, and in turn, that became very lucrative. We don't have that power anymore like we did back then, but back then it was big. We controlled the unions in this country. We controlled the dock workers, we controlled the Teamsters Union, we controlled a lot of unions. So it's very lucrative.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, could you tell me what that was like to kind of bring in money and kind of be on your own at that point at a very young age, and not only maybe provide for your father, but buy a couple of toys yourself?
Well, yeah, I mean, I also had legitimate business. I had 2 automobile dealerships. I had a film production company. I had a couple of restaurants that I was involved in. I had a leasing company. I had auto body shops. So, I had a lot going on. And then, of course, I was in the wholesale gasoline business, which was the biggest, I would have to say, scam. I was defrauding the government out of tax on every gallon of gasoline. So, and that kind of fell into my lap with somebody that came to me that was trying to devise this scheme to do just that. And together we were able to put it together. And that lasted for 6 or 7 years, almost 8 years. And it was a tremendous money earner, not only for me, but for the family.
Michael, before we get to that, I have to ask you about your encounter with Paul Castellano. I mean, he was derisively known by some, punishable by death, as the Chicken Man because he owned Dial Meats and Poultry, and he was a wholesaler. And I understood that you took a shipment at one of your stores in Long Island or something of maggot-infested chickens. And when you refused to pay for it, he actually asked for a sit down.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I got into it with his associate on the phone, not realizing he was a made guy, and he was cussing me out and I cussed him out. And I was only a recruit at that point. I wasn't made. So yeah, within a day or two, I got a call from my boss, and I went in to see Andrew, and he asked me all about it. And I told him. He said, "Do you realize that that was a made guy you were cursing out?" And I said, "Well, I didn't realize anything. I'm on the other end of the phone, and he sold me a bunch of maggot-filled chicken, and he wanted me to pay." And I said, "I'm not paying you, period." So that was what it all about. But Paul himself wanted this sit-down. So I had to sit down with Paul, my boss at that time, Tom DeBella, Andrew Russo, and the guy that I was cussing out. It was Paul's nephew or something. I don't know. He was a made guy. I forget who it was. But, they told me going in, they said, "Listen, don't talk. Don't say anything. Don't admit to anything. Just let us do all the talking." And at the end of the day, Paul was pretty heavy on me. At the end of the day, I didn't have to pay for that load of chickens, but I had to continue using him in my market because we bought a lot of poultry for him. So it was funny because at the end of it all, I took a little tongue lashing from Paul and my guys. And at the end of it all, we got back in the car and they cracked up laughing. They said, "We can't believe that Paul came here to sit over $700 worth of chickens." It was they were laughing about it, but that's who Paul was. I think the dollar meant everything to him, no matter how small it was, he wanted it. And, but that was my first encounter with Paul. I've seen him many times afterwards because my boss at that time was pretty close to him, and I always drove them around. So even though I wasn't in on the meetings when I was a recruit, I saw Paul quite often. He didn't like me.
Full disclosure, I'm Roben Farzad. It's my joy to welcome Michael Franzese. He was, of course, former capo in the Colombo crime family in New York. You should absolutely watch on Netflix Fear City, New York versus the Mafia. He's come clean. He found Christianity in prison in the early 1990s, and the 1992 book co-authored his autobiography, Quitting the Mob. And now he's gosh, you're there's a nickname that I think that you should take. Is it the Podfather, right? Bill Simmons was offered that at, the sports guy and everything, but you are just excellent on this, on Nat Geo or on Fear City, on your pod, on YouTube. It's definitely like a postmodern, I can imagine 1985, you witnessing what 2025 Michael Franzese has become.
No, I mean, if you would have told me that, I would have said you're crazy. I never thought I'd be writing books. I never thought I'd be, I've had over 2,000 speaking events in the past 30 years. I've been, all over television. Actually, I'm sitting with Nat Geo again later on today. I never expected this. Honestly, it wasn't a plan. It just happened for me, and fortunately, it's worked out well. And I have no complaints. I've been very fortunate, very blessed to be alive and free when every one of my former associates are either dead or in prison. So,
Yeah.
very
And
fortunate.
speaking of that, in the 10 or 15 years that preceded, of course, what happened in December of 85 outside of Sparks Steakhouse in the audacious taking down of Bilotti and Paul Castellano, you, of course, witnessed in your time your mentor, Joe Colombo, shot, almost very nearly killed, and was comatose. That was the end of his run in the mid-70s in Columbus Circle. You saw what happened to Crazy Joe Gallo, right? As a result of that, you saw what happened to Carmine Galante. There was no shortage of blood that was spilled in that time. You were surrounded by all sorts of violence. And I just want to get a sense for how much did you have to look behind your shoulders or over your back? I get the impression that you were a businessman. You were an earner. You maybe weren't one of the more violent people out there.
It's an interesting question because a lot of people have said to me, Michael, when I first witnessed the Colombo killing, I was 12 steps away from him when he went down. We were in Columbus Circle at that time. It was eye-opening. I love Joey. He was, like I said, a mentor to me. I knew him my whole life, and it was tragic. And prior to that, I saw another very dear friend of my dad's and friend of my family. He was a Jewish guy who was brutally murdered, and it had an impact on me. And people have said to me, Michael, why did you still get involved when you knew all of this? And I really can't answer that. I don't know why. I mean, some people might have been scared off by that, and I don't know if that's the right term, scared off. I don't know. I think it's something in you that allows you to be able to deal with this because, yeah, I mean, look, violence is a part of that life, and I've seen my share of it during my time, and people that I loved and cared about, people that I didn't care about were killed in that life. So when I walked away, was I concerned? Yes. But one of the horrors of that life, and you probably know this, you make a mistake, your best friend walks you into a room, you don't walk out again. And I had an experience close to that at one point. So when I walked away, I said, listen, I am a student of the life. I basically grew up in it with my dad. I was a pretty good learner on my own. I knew what the life was all about. I said, they're not going to walk me into a room. They're going to have to work to get me. So I moved out to the West Coast. It's one thing to send a hit squad to Brooklyn when you're walking around. It's another thing to send them across the country and try to kill somebody that's aware of it and then get away with it. So, I did plan it in that way. I could have never made it in New York. They would have gotten to me. There's no question about it. I had to get out of New York in order to survive this. So I didn't live in fear, quite honestly, because I didn't let fear cloud my judgment as to what I had to do in my life. But I was cautious. I never, sold my former associates short because I knew they were very capable. So what did I do? I changed my whole routine. Well, what do I mean by that? I didn't create patterns in my life. I didn't walk my dog every morning at 7 a.m. I didn't go to the same restaurant every Tuesday or Wednesday night. I stayed out of clubs. Clubs are a bad place for me. Somebody's in there. They know who I am. They make a call back to New York. I go out to the parking lot. Boom, I'm gone. I was very disciplined and diligent in taking care of myself. And, at the end of the day, there's two reasons I believe. Number one, I just outlasted everybody. Everybody had their own issues. A lot of people thought that I was going to become this major witness when I walked away. And the FBI contributed to that because what they did, they put my name on the witness list of trials that were going on in New York. even though I was rebuking them and rebutting them, they kept putting my name on the list, trying to pressure me. Well, these trials keep coming up, and I don't show up. So now people are saying, hey, and I kept sending word back to my father, who was out on parole during some of that time. I said, Dad, don't believe any of this. I'm not coming in. But, people always say that, and then you see him on the witness stand. So you don't know what to believe. So I had a number of years that were very touch and go for me, but it all worked out. And when they finally realized that I wasn't there to hurt anybody, yeah, I spoke to the government, but I didn't give them anything that could put people in prison or anything like that. I was playing a game with them that blew up in my face because they eventually, when I was out on parole, they violated my parole and said, hey, you're playing a game, you're going back to jail. And that's exactly what happened. And I did another 3 years in solitary. So, it was a long process. That's all I could say. And, I always say this, there's no blueprint for walking away from that life publicly and surviving. So this was kind of, paint by number. Let me see how every day is going and how I can work this thing out. And then it just all worked out.
So you're on the inside. Was it 1991 that a prison guard handed you a Bible? How did that work?
It was 19 when they violated my parole because, again, they were upset with me. They said, you're pulling a game on us. You didn't give us any information. You're going back to prison. They violated my parole. They said they were going to indict me on a murder case, but they could never indict me on it. But I did almost 4 years I did 3 years on the violation. They gave me 4 years. That was the maximum. But that first night, quite honestly, it was a very bad night because they said, look, we're indicting you for murder. You're never going to see the street again. You're done. And I was very concerned that night. And it was a prison guard that handed me that Bible, and that was it was life-changing. It started me on my journey. For the next 29 months and 7 days that I was in solitary, it started me on a journey that has held fast for me.
Just postscript on this before we go back to break. What happened 40 years ago, Paul Castellano and everything, was that the beginning of the end for the general outfit? I mean, it was the end of I get the impression that Giuliani and others got dead serious after that. And there was some violence if you followed Philadelphia and the various other things that happened. But the government was able to get its act together, and I think in RICO and everything else, and break the back of the family's kind of hegemony over the city and various swaths of the economy. I think in my head that John Gotti died of cancer in prison in 2002. What was he thinking was going to happen? Was he so cornered that he really had no choice but this kind of audacious kind of coup de grace?
No, John Gotti had a choice. I mean, look, it happened to Joe Colombo. I mean, Joe Colombo with the league. It was a great idea. I was totally supportive of the league, and I believe Joe Colombo had nothing but the best interests of the Italian people at hand at that point. But you can't be a mob boss and be that out front. You just can't. I mean, you got to learn from people like Carlo Gambino and even Frank Costello, who realized we have to stay in the shadows. You can't be a John Gotti and throw your chest out at them and give them the finger. You can't. You're not going to last. The government has too many weapons, too many tools. They're going to get you eventually. And John just didn't get it or didn't care, and it ended up the way it ended. But, a lot of people say that John Gotti is responsible for the demise of the mob in New York. I can say this. He didn't do it any good by being so outspoken. He really did infuriate the FBI and the Department of Justice, and they made it that, hey, we're going to get this guy no matter what. And that means if we got to get the guys around him until we eventually get him, well, we're going to do it. So he didn't he didn't do any favors. But it was really the RICO Act that crippled that life, because that law is so extensive. It's so hard to defend. And the consequences are very serious, and, a lot of guys flipped as a result of RICO. A lot of guys.
I mean, it just generally gave, as a kind of continuing criminal enterprise, it gave the government and the various agencies who were warring, the chance to cast a huge net. Yes. Under kind of very loose explanation that this is the organization and the tentacles are like this, and we'll bring people in, flip them, and get them to the very top of the families, as you saw with Sammy the Bull Gravano, which was unthinkable.
Absolutely. I mean, it broke the back. There's no question about it. And like I said, so many guys became informants as a result of the RICO Act. And listen, no matter how good the investigative prowess is of the Department of Justice and the FBI, you always need informants. You always need witnesses. And, they did it. I always say this. Fear kept people in line, no question. You're afraid of making a mistake. The consequences are serious. But what happened is the fear of the mob was transferred to the fear of the government when the government said, hey, you either cooperate with us or we're throwing you in on this RICO case. We're indicting you for murder, which we couldn't do before. Because remember, murder was a state crime. It wasn't a federal crime. But now we're indicting you for murder and you're going away for the rest of your life. So you either cooperate with us, we'll put you in a witness program, we'll give you some money, you're going to put your guys away so you don't have to worry about them, and you go free. Well, that was a bargain that most people took. A lot of guys became informants. A lot.
Yeah, there's in my book, there were people that said I could literally take my chance, decades die on the inside or get a chance at freedom outside. One way or another, I was going to die and I had to face the consequences.
Yeah, and look at how many informants are on YouTube right now.
Right.
I mean,
full
really?
Disclosure. Full disclosure, stay with us.
Yes.
This show podcast to NPR, Spotify, YouTube. You can listen and watch. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. We are on Apple Podcasts, all of the great podcatchers. A shout out to our radio listeners on WVTF, Radio IQ across the great Commonwealth. We're out west on KPPQ in Ventura. We are in Asheville, North Carolina, indeed, on WPVM. I put them all at one neat link, fulldradio.com. Again, .com. Tell your girlfriend, your mother-in-law, your criminal defense attorney. And if you'd like to reach me, my DMs are always open. Full disclosure, I'm Roben Farzad. If you're just joining us, my guest is Michael Franzese. He joins us from the West Coast in SoCal. He was, of course, a capo in the Colombo crime family, and he published in 1992 in his conversion to finding Christianity again. He co-authored the autobiography, Quitting the Mob, and now he's a prolific personality, I would say, in the true crime industrial complex on YouTube. You see him on Nat Geo. I loved him on the Netflix series Fear City, kind of explaining things and coming clean in very cold-eyed business terms. I got to ask you, this is a question I've been dying to ask you, Michael. What were your impressions? And I'm going somewhere with this. I'm not trying to lead the witness. When Donald Trump ran for president, I asked you this in 2015. Donald Trump and his fixer, Roy Cohn, were very known quantities to the families in New York. Roy Cohn, of course, he was representing Fat Tony Salerno. He worked with the Gambino families and others. Donald Trump himself must have been intimately familiar with the fact that you could not build anything in the 1980s unless you went through the concrete club, and they would take a scrape and it would have to go and pay off. Even if it was kind of looked the other way, you have to imagine that he was mob wise, considering who his fixer was and considering what the Trump companies had to do to put all those skyscrapers up in the 1980s. And here he is now, president of the United States, twice elected.
Well, yeah, but let's be clear on this. So is Helmsley, so is Gutterman, so all the big developers in New York. They knew they had to deal with us. So Trump was just one in the mix. Yeah, he had a little more familiarity because of Roy Cohn, who was representing me at one point in time.
That's crazy. His mentor was representing you. I mean, Studio 55. I mean, it's the 80s were whack.
They were whack. So obviously Donald was aware. But I want to make it clear, he wasn't controlled by the mob the same way Helmsley wasn't. Gutterman, I had to deal with Gutterman. I don't know if you know who he was. He was another big developer, and I had a union deal with him, on several projects that he was on. But I said, wow, Donald Trump, an outsider running for president. I mean, we all had that same kind of thought about it. And we liked it because, hey, he's a New Yorker, and let's see what he does. But there was nothing more than that. I know a lot of people try to intimate that he was mobbed up. He wasn't mobbed up. He really wasn't. And, just because he knew about the mob and he had the same attorney, it didn't mean he was mobbed up. Donald wasn't the kind of guy that you can control in that regard. And even Sammy Gravano said that. I think they tried to make a move on him and it didn't work out.
Well, tell me, in a footnote in the violent era of this everybody was shocked when this guy, Frank Cali, was clipped in Staten Island. He was the Gambino boss. And I'm going to ask you what this stuff even means today. It was March of 2019. And everybody thought, gosh, the New York Post is going to run with it. Is this the biggest hit since Big Paulie? Like, they took out a person in front of his house, in his SUV in Toad Hill or where Paul Castellano lived himself. And it turns out it was just a QAnon conspiratorial person.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody even could tell you who Frank Cali was or who the head of the Gambinos was.
Yeah, well, at first I said, wow, what's going on? But then, like you said, it was proven to be just a crazy situation. It had nothing to do with the mob, Look, back in my day, and you probably remember this, there wasn't a day that went by when the New York Post, the Daily News, the Long Island Press, Newsday, there was some article about one of us or all of us, many of us. Now, I read the New York Post every morning online, maybe every 6 months. We just had the NBA gambling thing not too long ago. maybe every 6 months, which shows a couple of things. Number one, they're not as active as they were in my day. And number two, for those that are active, they finally got smart and saying, you know what, we can't be out in the limelight like this if we want to operate. So, they're doing the normal gambling stuff. That'll never change. That's the biggest business of the mob. I'm sure they got money out on the street and they're doing their things. If they get a deal where they can hijack a truck, they'll do that. There was once wrote something about the businesses of the mob, and they were actually writing the percentages of what this business brought in and the kind of money that it brought in. It was the most ridiculous thing I ever saw. I was going to say, what do you think? People hijack trucks and then write it down in their memo and how much money they made from the hijacks, and then they hand the data over to somebody that they can calculate it. It was
that's what I want to ask you. What do you even do today in the kind of the residual stub La Cosa Nostra? One, again, so much of this is informed by the turn of the century, Sopranos. And I remember initially it was April, and he was terminally ill, and he was saying, does anyone even want to be captain? Does anyone even want to be Don of this family? I mean, you just bring attention, you put the crosshairs on you, but to the extent that it exists today, and it does exist, what are they trafficking in? Obviously, the evergreens of money laundering. There's a shy book. There's ecstasy. I don't know if it veers into crypto and various other things. Certainly not nearly as lucrative as it used to be.
No, and listen, they'll get involved with anything they could get involved in. It's not like there's A, B, C, D, E. This is what we have to do. Shylock and money, yeah, sometimes they'll bust out of business. There are some, little bit of union control, mostly in locals, not in a large scheme like that. So look, they do whatever they can do to grind out a living. It's that simple. The thing is that guys on the street are willing to cross the line and do things that are illegal. And that's it. And there's a lot of opportunity out there for illegal things. It may not be very lucrative, but it pays the bills and makes some people some money, So, and then they get involved in legitimate things too. It's not like everything has to be illegal.
And I have to think that the anecdote I remember when I was reporting my book is that literally New York in the time of Fear City was falling apart. The West Side Highway was abandoned and derelict, and there were people that were taking it apart for parts. Yep. Like if there was nothing else, you could get a couple of roughnecks to strip copper out of things in that dereliction. Yeah. And certainly that's not the New York that we know today. But let me ask you on kind of cash. This is another mundane question. Cash has had such a demise. I take it out really a handful of times a year to pay the barber because she prefers cash over credit. It must have made life very difficult. It's also, I think, a lot harder to hijack a truck right now. I mean, there are RFID tags inside every carton of cigarettes, right?
Yeah. Well, look, there's a way to launder money. It's funny you said that because the only time I use cash, if I'm tipping a valet driver or something like that, we don't use cash anymore. Somebody gave me back some change. I had to buy something. It was like 52 cents. So I gave him $1. I said, I haven't had change in my pocket in months. You don't even carry it anymore. It's crazy. But listen, there's ways. I'm not going to teach. There's ways to get around that. And there's ways to, put money in different places and wash money. And, a lot of times a guy will have a business for that particular purpose, just to wash money. And there are operations where you can do that.
Have you been asked a lot about crypto?
I have, and I don't get involved in it. It's something that I'm not really familiar, never really had an interest in, and I'm not really familiar with it. As a matter of fact, I've been asked to several times to promote it, and I won't do it because it's, how could I put it? There's still some shadiness to it. And, the right people always know how to manipulate things. And I'm not throwing an aspersion on anybody. I'm out there. There's plenty of people that are legit with crypto. But I'm leery of it at the moment.
Michael, talk to me about, as I said before, the true crime industrial complex. It must blow your mind that there is unending appetite. As a true crime author myself, and what is it about us why is it that we perseverate on the Gotti story? Or the Bergen Hunt Fish Club, or these various other things that come out of it, that they can go on for hours and hours of podcasts, and it can dogleg into various things on Netflix and YouTube. And what, honestly, the type of people who would watch Lifetime television 15 years ago are really into true crime right now.
Well, listen, when it comes to the mob, you got to be honest. There's nothing more intriguing and romanticized, since the days of Al Capone than the American mafia. That's it. These figures are bigger than life. Hollywood has done a tremendous played a tremendous role in making these figures bigger than life. The Godfather, what did I mean, people were rooting for the Godfather. Everybody's rooting for Don Corleone. They're rooting for Al Pacino, Michael Corleone. These were murderers. They were killers. They're mobsters. They're bosses. But it's been romanticized to such a degree, like no other. No other organized criminal enterprise.
I mean, is there a Robin Hood element to it? You saw when Gotti was convicted in the early '90s that viral guy's like, "What murder? He was the best guy around." No one in that vicinity would say that. No, he was a murderer and he was a trafficker and there was death and destruction in his past.
But why? Why? Because he took care of his neighborhood like we all do. There's no crime in our neighborhood. And the people that he went in against were other mobsters. So, the thing is, and I say this all the time, and I'm not trying to justify anything. Yes, we were who we were. But we mostly hurt our own. We all took an oath. We all understood what we were getting involved in. And when we took it out on somebody, we took it out on one another. We didn't go out, when we had a war among us, we didn't go out and kill innocent people, certainly not intentionally. Maybe it happened, but it wasn't intentional. We killed our own. So people looked up and said, wow, this guy was great in the neighborhood. He took care of us. We have no crime. He throws Christmas parties. He closes down the street every Christmas. He gives out turkeys for Thanksgiving. I mean, good guys, And they all looked at us like that in our neighborhood. I walk into my neighborhood. My dad walked in my head. We were kings, but we took care of the people, So that's why a lot of people were for Gotti. They weren't against him.
Let me ask you, by 1986, Fortune magazine, no less than Fortune magazine, had listed you on its roster of most wealthy and powerful mafia bosses. Of course, you were, by then you were getting ready for prison, or you had spent some time in prison, but you had this gasoline skim operation, which even today, to a person on the street, no one loves the big oil majors. Nobody loves the gas station. Nobody loves the price of gas. They would think it's a victimless crime. But there is something being taken from the public. I mean, there is the public coffers. Would you explain how it worked? I mean, it's very easy to love you for that crime, right? I would say, it's the right kind of parasitism. But money was taken away from things.
Well, do you want me to become a hero in California? If I was doing the gas business down in California, I would be a hero. Because the tax on gasoline in California is 80 cents a gallon between state and federal. Well, I would be taking that 80 cents a gallon, right? And I'd be giving at least 50 cents back to the public because the price at the pump would be 50 cents less. So people would love me. They would come to my gas station and say...
explain how it worked in New York. I mean, I would say in the most defensible, if I was greenwashing, whitewashing what you were doing, you were an arbitrageur. You came in and in fact, you accelerated everything for everyone and you got paid for splitting the difference.
Absolutely. We gave half the money back to the public and we kept half the money of the tax.
How did the scam even work? There was money that was gasoline that was being moved from trucks and that you would intervene and...
No. It was very simple. We were licensed to collect the tax on every gallon of gasoline. We were licensed to collect it. How I got the license is another story. I had to pay off politically because I couldn't get them, but I had 18 licenses at one point, all involved in shell companies. I had a shell company for each license. But so we were able to collect the tax and basically not pay it. And we had a scheme that allowed us about 10 months before the government really came down on us. And during that time, we just keep collecting the tax money, selling gas, collecting the tax money. So what we would do is if gas was $1 at the pump, you had to pay $1. I'm just throwing it out. Well, with us, you'd pay 90 cents because we were keeping 30 cents to 40 cents a gallon in tax money. So we were able to reduce our price at the pump by 10 cents, 15 cents, whatever we wanted to do. So we were giving some money back to the public in our stations. Our stations had lines out all the time because we were the cheapest gas around.
Cheapest, yeah.
Yeah, and I had hundreds of gas stations that we were servicing. So, but the scheme was very intricate, and we had to, the real key was, number one, obtaining the license, and number two, holding the government off for 10 months. Because you were required to pay on a monthly basis. But we were able to get around that for about 10 months, sometimes a year.
Was everything transacted in cash? Would the tax be collected in cash? And what do you do with all that cash?
We had both. We had cash and we had a lot of wire transfers at that time. I sent a lot of money out to various banks that we were dealing with, and I had a lot of cash. I mean, there was times when I was sitting on, 20, 25 million in cash.
Now, I would ask this. Sometimes I think there's a great screenplay in this, and I'm not trying to make you complicit in a crime. You've done your time. I don't want the feds on you or anything. Suppose I found a suitcase of 25 million in cash, small bills or whatever it is, not marked, no RFID tag or anything. How does a person even begin to launder that in the modern day and age where bank regulations, interbank transfers, valence, everything? It's not a matter of me just opening up a pizzeria or a car wash. It used to be a lot easier.
Well, listen, in today's day and age, if you got yourself if you got that kind of money, you got a private plane. And there's various places throughout the world where you can put that kind of money and nobody's going to know it. Trust me.
It seems like that vise is kind of narrow. Like the Swiss, the Bahamians, others, the government seem hell bent on capturing it. You yourself know if there's money being left on the table, the feds, the IRS, everybody, the Treasury is incented in going after it.
Yeah, if they know about it. But, if they don't know about it, listen, I can tell you this right now, and I'm not just saying anything. If I was back in the gas business now, I could take $500,000 down a month and they wouldn't even miss it. I mean, we were doing, $8, $9, $10 million a week. You do $500,000 a month, they wouldn't even miss it. And it would take them so long before they figured out I would die of old age before that. Now, obviously, I'm not going to do it, but, they're not as sophisticated as you think in certain regards. They're really not. And we proved that by running an operation for almost 8 years.
Full disclosure, I'm Roben Farzad. Our guest is Michael Franzese. He was capo, of course, in the Colombo family. He had come clean and found Christianity in prison in the early 1990s. The book is Quitting the Mob, which was his co-authored autobiography in 1992. Could I ask you, in the interest, in the 10 minutes or so we have left, life imitating art and vice versa, what did you think of The Sopranos when it came out? I know they got a couple of Dons on tape talking about it. There was only a handful of times in the series which I and others have watched religiously. It's now truly a pillar of the golden age of television where, I think Tony turns to Sil and is like, that's what they said about Gravano. You never saw the worlds kind of, pivot into each other. It was a fictional world and you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But it must have been fascinating to see something that was so, in addition to the canon of, the Godfather movies and Casino and Goodfellas.
Well, listen, I thought Gandolfini was terrific. He was a great actor, did a great thing. But I always said this, I sum it up this way. If a mob boss was ever visiting a psychiatrist, he'd be in the trunk of his car by the end of the week, along with the psychiatrist. So that would never happen. But he would never be allowed to continue that. But I thought the characters were great in many regards. It followed a line of truth in a lot of ways, and then it went off crazy in a lot of ways, But listen, it was a brilliant series. You cannot take anything away from it. And it was that series that caused all the great series to follow because they saw how successful that was. And there's been some brilliant television series, Breaking Bad and all of this that followed The Sopranos. I had an opportunity to work on Sopranos, and I blew it. Because when David Chase got in touch with me early on, he was creating for Fox.
Right.
And it didn't work. And then I refused it. I turned it down through my agent, Jack Gilardi, because I had just gotten out of prison. I was on parole, and I didn't want to get involved. It was a mistake, because if I would have stayed with it, I probably would have been a consultant, for The Sopranos when it hit HBO. But look, it was a brilliant series. I never watched the complete, 7 or 8 seasons that it had. But since I had my podcast, I reviewed certain episodes of it, and people always react well to it. But look, it was a great series. There's a lot of good ones out there now. I mean, the Godfather of Harlem. It's fictional. A lot of it's fictional, but, it captures the essence of the life. Boardwalk Empire captures the essence of the life. There was a lot of great series out there that have done great. The one I really love, it's Peaky Blinders. I don't know if
of course.
I couldn't watch it originally because I couldn't understand them. And then somebody said, do the subtitles. And I watched the subtitles. And then I watched the whole series. It was magnificent. So, there's a lot of brilliant television out there right now. And the mob stuff, it just always seems to work.
Michael, tell us about you in the few minutes we have left. I want to know about the wine company. Why Armenian wine? I see... when I see some ads out there, you're talking about happy occasions. You talk about being blessed. There's this gratitude. There's this. It's not a menacing person anymore. It's invoking family, togetherness, wine. What was the idea to get into that, and what are some of the other overtures that you've gotten from other business partnerships?
Well, I'm in the wine and the pizza business, but when the way the wine happened is a young man from Armenia. He came to me. His family has a vineyard in Armenia, 25 years old. They've had that vineyard. They wanted to introduce Armenian wine into the United States. And the story behind Armenian wine is when Noah's Ark landed and the flood subsided, it lands at the foot of Mount Ararat, which is Armenia. And so the new vineyards under the new civilization, first vineyards under the new civilization, were grown in Armenia. So it's kind of transforming, new civilization. The story of wine is transforming from the time it's planted to what it becomes in the bottle. And my story is transformation. So they came to me to brand it. And people say, Michael, why not Italian wine? Well, there's 1,800 varieties of Italian wine. What am I going to introduce that's different? Just because I'm Italian doesn't mean I need, even though I love Italian wine. So I like the story, and I said, I think this could work. And in 3 years, I mean, the business that we have is amazing. And USA Today say we're the next billion-dollar company. So we'll see. I'm working my butt off, I can tell you that. But it's really proving to be well. People are loving the wine. We have these new fruit wines that the people are going crazy over. So I'm very excited about it, and I'm putting a lot of effort into it. I tell people I'm not just a name on the bottle. I'm a partner, and we work hard. And then I'm in the pizza business with a friend of mine from the old days. We go back 40 years. He's a tremendous baker. And we have frozen pizza that's second to none on the planet. It's the best frozen pizza you'll ever eat. We just built a huge kitchen in Henderson, Nevada. We can turn out 1 million slices a day. And now we're going to be in markets, in the frozen food section all over the country. We also have pizza vending machines. And our pizza comes out of that machine the same way it came out of the oven. It's an amazing technology. And we're now putting them in various places throughout the country, too. So very excited. The only problem I have is at 74 years old, I'm working harder than I ever worked, but it seems to be going in the right direction. And then, of course, I have the YouTube channel, and, I've come to dislike a word very much, and that word is content, because that's all I get. My team, I need content. Every single day I'm on, doing my thing. And but like I said, it's paying off. We've been very blessed, and I think we have a bright future with both of these companies. It's looking really well.
Close us out by talking about your mentoring of younger people and people on the inside. I mean, we had George Valdez on the show, one of the founders of the U.S., Medellin cocaine cartel. He was in my book, Hotel Scarface, and he too found Christianity on the inside. And he thinks it's so important to go back and talk to kids who may have been scared and ill-informed and find themselves in the prison industrial complex right now, giving them a chance that there's hope, that there's a way out. It's not always annihilation and death and destruction.
No, there definitely is a chance. The unfortunate thing is most of our young men, especially, and girls, but, they grow up without a father figure. And I have said this, and I'll repeat it, and I'm totally committed to this. The root problems of all the root cause, I should say, of all the problems we're having here in this country is the breakup of the family. 80% of these young kids that I met in prison, no father figure in the house. So what happens? They got a mom that's trying to do her best, usually young. The father isn't around. She's trying to make her ends meet. The kid gravitates to the street, gets involved with the local drug dealer, gangbanger. Before you know, he's in prison. They have no guidance, and they don't understand. They're like little wild animals. And I started to realize this when I was in prison, and I started to see so many of them. So I started to counsel them even before I was a Christian. And I said, what are you guys doing? You see what's happening on the street. You're going to end up spending the rest of your life in prison. It's going to be in and out, a revolving door. And I understood they had no guidance. So, when I did become a Christian, I came out, I was committed to helping these young kids better themselves. Because, look, I got a lot of credibility because they all think the mafia is the biggest gang in the world. And I tell them, don't tell me you can't walk away from that life. I walked away from the biggest gang in the world. There is a way. But, I also had to counsel people and tell them, listen, you can't tell these kids to break away from the gang and send them back in their neighborhoods. That's dangerous. I said, the only way I'll mentor them is if I have a way to get them out of what they're doing. So I always make sure there's a program that I can send them to after I mentor them, because you know what? A lot of these kids don't want to be on the street. They want a better way. They just don't know how. And so they need guidance. They need mentorship.
The closing irony for me is that you talk about the 2 years at Hofstra. You did what you did because you loved your dad. Do you ever wonder, what if you did not take that fork?
Yeah, I mean, look, life would have been different. I probably would have been a doctor. That's where I was headed. I had an interest in it. I don't know, maybe my mom and dad wanted it more than me. I have to look back and say that, because if I was so deeply committed, then that's what I would have done. So But yeah, my father was really important to me. But, my dad loved me. My dad was a great mentor. Aside from him putting me into that life or agreeing to propose me into that life, he taught me well. My father, taught me to be honest, taught me to have integrity, taught me to treat women and children properly. He wasn't a bad dad in that regard. He gave me the right teaching. Unfortunately, he was a bit misguided in the steps that he took in his life, but he was a good man and a good father, I believe. And people argue with me, oh, come on, Michael, he made you go into that life and he was a killer and all of that. He was a good dad. And I'll say that no matter what. And he and I had our differences. When I walked away, look, the feds told me he went along with the contract on my life. Do I believe my dad would have ever pulled the trigger? No. I don't believe that at all. But he did what he had to do when he was on the street, and I get it. I understand. I tell you what bugs me. There's a lot of guys in that life, and they became an informant. The life let me down. They didn't treat me right. I did this and I did that. And you know what? 99% of that is nonsense. We got into that life. We knew what we were getting into. This is the street. This is not, the parish church or anything like that. So don't be telling me, they didn't treat you right and they didn't do this and they didn't do that, because that's the street. That's not an excuse for doing what you're doing. If you want to walk away, hey, you get it. This is a bad life. You get it. But don't start blaming everybody else for a decision that you made, to get out of it the way you got out of it. And I've said that to people and they didn't like what I said, but that's my feeling.
Michael Franzese, obviously I can go on for hours with you. I've read your body of work. I loved you in Fierce City. I've read the autobiography, listened to the pod. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me. And I just do want to say this. Fierce City, I've done a number of these documentaries, but I think Fierce City stands out as the best of all of them. They did a great job. Forgetting my part, they just did a great job on that series. It was really,
I think
really well done.
Go back, everybody, if it's still on Netflix. It was a Netflix original, but cobbling together, how, for example, they planted the stuff in Paul Castellano's house, recreating the scenes, toggling between the present and the old bristled FBI person, and recreating that in the past. And that's why I had wished our doc treatment had worked with them, but it was at a different time. I very much admire that from afar. And thank you, sir.
Well, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me, and maybe we'll do it again sometime.
Anytime. Full disclosure, special thanks again to Ian Stewart. If you are listening to us on the radio, note that while we cut for broadcast, the entirety of every interview is on podcast, whether on the NPR app, Spotify, Apple, YouTube. Find them all at one neat link, fulldradio.com. Again, fulldradio.com. And recommend us to a friend. And catch me on both CNN and NPR's Here and Now. I'm Roben Farzad. Thank you for listening. Back with you next week.